Welcome to another episode of the North Carolina Tar Heels Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Logan Lazarchik, beat writer for the North Carolina Tar Heels on SI. Today with another episode. Hope you guys all enjoyed your weekend. In this episode, we will be talking about news and updates that developed over the last few days since Friday. And before we start, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. You can find this podcast wherever you get podcasts on YouTube, Spotify, Apple. But we're at the time of the off season where news kind of slows down a bit. But over the weekend, North Carolina had a couple of pieces that I will be discussing today. A couple of intriguing updates. One with a player that has already been on the roster, and one that could potentially be joining Chapel Hill in the near future. But let's start with the player that North Carolina brought in over the offseason, Matt Abel from North Carolina State in the transfer portal. The 6'5", 220-pound shooting guard wing. He could play multiple positions. Finally signed with North Carolina over the weekend. There was some concern after he was invited to the NBA scouting combine and elected to go through the process. And I covered this about a week ago, how it wasn't too overly concerning that he was going through the process. That was more of a due diligence and, gaining information from scouts, from league executives of where he can improve his game to potentially be drafted in 2027. But Matt Abel signing with North Carolina officially is major news for the program. He's still in and still participating in the NBA scouting combine, which the NBA lottery was just on Sunday over the weekend. And he's going to go through the process. It's about a week-long, process with the teams, speaking to scouts, workouts, all those type of things. But at the end of the day, I do expect him to be in Chapel Hill next season, and him signing that deal, signing with the Tar Heels, is a indicator that will be the case. And Matt Abel, I've talked about it, extensively over the last few episodes on this podcast, that how important he's going to be for North Carolina this upcoming season. As I've just stated, he could play multiple positions. He could play the point guard, shooting guard. He could play on the wing. I don't expect him to play much power forward or anything like that unless, North Carolina really goes small at points during the season, if it's, whether it's foul trouble or just depending on who they're playing against. But I do think he's going to end up being the three for them, with Nicholas Abdalis and Terrence Brown handling the 1 and 2 in the starting lineup. Matt Abel, very underrated acquisition by Michael Malone this offseason. Last season with North Carolina State under Will Wade, he averaged 8.8 points and 3.4 rebounds while shooting 41% from the field and 35% from three-point range while averaging 21 minutes off the bench. That's a steady production for, limited time on the court. And I do think his time on the court will increase with North Carolina in this system. And, North Carolina, they're going to have to depend on a lot of moving parts this season. And Matt Abel is going to be one of those parts. And there's a lot of newcomers. Jaron Stevenson's the only returning player from last season's roster who will be playing extensive minutes in 2026. So Matt Abel is going to come in right away. I think he'll compete with Maximo Adams for the starting small forward spot. But Mike Malone personally recruited him, personally spoke with him, and went out to land this guard. So I expect Abel to be the starting small forward. He's entering his sophomore year in Chapel Hill. He's from, he just played for North Carolina State last season, so he's familiar with the area, with ACC competition. So I expect Malone to lean on him. But major news for North Carolina to at least know that they will be retaining Matt Abel, because about a week ago, there was a lot of concern from Tar Heel fans that Abel could forego the opportunity to play with Michael Malone at North Carolina to declare for the draft. But it really didn't make much sense for a lot of reasons. And, I was never truly worried that he was going to leave, because if you look at this draft class, which I just stated the lottery was over the weekend, there is a bunch of talent in this draft class, and he was going to be pushed down the board, potentially be a second-round pick, and there was no guarantee that he was going to even be drafted. The draft class is incredibly deep. There's a surplus of talent, especially freshman talent from last year, and I think it was in Abel's best interest not to enter the draft, and it serves him better to play in it's going to be a pro-like system with Michael Malone. Malone coached multiple years in the NBA. He coached the Denver Nuggets. He's going to implement that same type of scheme, same rotations, same style into North Carolina's offense and you're going to see Matt Abel, I think, shine in those circumstances. So I think when you kind of look at, opportunity and, just the landscape of the NBA right now in the draft, it really didn't make much sense for Matt Abel to forego his sophomore season and an opportunity to play under Michael Malone with these allotment of players. This is another thing. He's going to be playing with a much improved roster than what he had at North Carolina State, albeit the Wolfpack did beat North Carolina pretty handedly last year. That was without, Caleb Wilson in the lineup at that time. So I think, you have to kind of take it out of a grain of salt, but he's going to be in a system with, Abdallah, Terrence Brown, two offensive-friendly guards who are going to give him ample opportunities to score and produce. And Michael Malone's also going to create opportunities for him to produce. So I think I was never truly worried that he was going to leave North Carolina and really not play a single minute. I think he originally signed with North Carolina, or he originally committed to North Carolina with the idea that it could elevate his game. And then once he kind of got, more attention than he thought from NBA scouts, NBA league executives, then he decided to go through that process. But and all credit to him, he deserves to go through a process, learn what, NBA teams, how they view him, what he needs to improve on. So he's going to go through that process, like I said. And but at the end of the day, North Carolina will have Matt Abel in uniform next season, which is major good news for the program. Another topic that I want to discuss, and this is more about speculation and more about potential adding to the roster. So North Carolina, front court is a major question mark at this point in the offseason. They've kind of bolstered their backcourt solidified with the aforementioned players I spoke about. But the front court, Henry Vasar leaving, Caleb Wilson, both in the draft. And then you had Zayn Hyde transfer to South Florida. There's a lot of question marks in that area. And in this offseason, they signed Sayan Keita and Cade Betterman. Keita from Barcelona, Betterman from Northwestern. But there really isn't depth in that position. Betterman right now is the only bench piece that is a center to provide minutes off the bench for Keita. And Keita is also a raw prospect. So front court there, specifically the center position, there's a lot of concerns, I would say, right now about how that's going to look next season. And, there's going to be growing pains in that. And so over the weekend, there was some developing reports from David Sisk of 247 Sports. The Tar Heels and Malone have been in contact with Greek center Alexandros Samodurov. He's 6'11", 212 pounds. Kind of needs to fill out his frame a little bit. But according to Sisk, the Greek center is former teammates with Abdallas, and there is, serious connections with Abdallas. And Sisk reports same agents, number one. Number two, they go back a long way from when they were together in Greece. They had even talked when they were younger about playing together if they went overseas to college or the pros. So, and they have a very close relationship as well. There's been murmurs that he is leaning towards North Carolina and he's another player that is in the draft process right now. He's considering the NBA draft as well. But if he decides to not go through with the draft, the connection with Abdallas is a major component in this development. And North Carolina able to landing, if they're able to land him, this center who he's not just a center who places back to the basket. He's not one that is dependent on guards creating for him. He can shoot from the perimeter. He can pass. He can play off the ball. So it's another versatile piece that North Carolina could be adding to their rotation. And like I've talked about this in multiple articles over the past 2 weeks, but this this team is going to be predicated on versatility, on offense, on defense, the ability to operate in multiple positions on the floor, the ability to defend multiple positions on the floor. North Carolina is going to be I think one of those teams. Like right now, nobody's really, considering them as a legitimate national title contender, and I don't know if they'll ever get to that point next season. I do think this is Michael Malone. It's really about developing a culture, developing this roster, specifically at the beginning of the year. So I think versatility, that's going to be a major strength of this team. I do expect 3-point shooting to improve. Uh, Offensive production, offensive efficiency will also improve under Michael Malone and with this personnel. But this is just another player that, adds another piece of the puzzle and another one that's going to complicate things for opposing teams. And in the ACC, especially with Duke and Louisville, you're going to have multiple players that can play multiple roles. And, I think in Malone's system, these players are going to be magnified and highlighted. Their skill sets are going to be something that will be apparent off, the first game of the season. And I think the first game of the season, the first couple of months of the season leading up to conference play, is when you are going to see Malone, kind of experiment with this offense a little bit, experiment with this roster a little bit. Like I said, Jaren Stevenson's really the only returning player that will be playing, extensive minutes, serious minutes on the court. Jane Young, he'll be there. Isaiah Dennis, he will also be there. But those are two players that really did not play a lot last season. And they will definitely be depth pieces in 2026 again. So North Carolina, there's a lot of moving parts. It's kind of tough to gauge of how good this team is going to be. Earlier over the weekend as well, Andy Katz, CBS Sports, Andy Katz, College Basketball Insider, released his top 76 rankings since the NCAA tournament field got expanded to 76 teams last Friday. And North Carolina was listed at 33 on that list, which kind of shows you their current status right now in college basketball. And they're not really considered one of these top, level teams right now. I think even Joe Lunardi had, he released his bracketology latest projections based on the new 76 team field. And North Carolina was a 9 seed. So, and prior to that, they were a 7 seed before Henry Vasar declared for the draft. So it's going to be an uphill battle for North Carolina to establish themselves as, even higher than, 6, 7 seed at this point. I do believe with Michael Malone, he's already shown the ability that he can recruit. He got hired, less than 24 hours before the portal officially opened, and he was introduced at the Dean E. Smith Center on the same day as the portal opened. And he's been able to assemble a roster that, I think, like I said, people aren't considering North Carolina a serious contender at this point. But, the fact that he's been able to build a roster with this much talent, with players that fit his offense, fit his scheme, I think you have to give all the credit to him. And, Samudorov would be another addition that would make a lot of sense for Michael Malone. And it's interesting to see if Malone, if he's able to pull off this signing, if he continues to scout overseas or continues to attempt to bolster that front court. I expect it to be an area that he will continue to at least explore, because I think North Carolina's backcourt, they have a lot of depth there. You have Matt Abel, you have Maxwell Adams, who can also handle the ball. And so I think front court right now is the main issue for North Carolina, specifically the center position. But this would be a major, major get for Malone and his staff. And I think Samudorov would definitely either operate at backup center, and I don't expect it, I've seen projections online of starting lineups if this happened, that Jaren Stevenson would revert to a bench role. I still don't foresee that happening. Stevenson, in his senior year, second year in Chapel Hill, I don't think he signed on to return to North Carolina to return to the bench. So I expect Jaren Stevenson to be this power forward, Samudorov to be a depth piece alongside Bennerman as a center, and Keita to be in the starting lineup. But I think there's a lot of exciting times ahead for North Carolina this season. There may be some growing pains in the beginning of the year, but if you are a North Carolina fan, I think that you should be relatively hopeful for next season under Michael Malone. But, with all that being said, that'll be for our episode today. Again, I appreciate you guys listening, and I'll be back tomorrow with another episode about news and updates and anything that happens in Chapel Hill.